first time I've seen the falls. Up close, you can actually get to where that water is, and it's almost unnerving. Thinking about some body needed this one big wave, up it over. Yeah. I was having a good day and hadn't come to lunch with you fine people, so I decided I was going to go in and see if I could get over the phone. I was thinking of my grandfather probably at the time. I'll tell you what, if it gets be halfway through and I feel like I'm on fire or something.
You're about to burst into flames.
I know go to church on occasion, so
Okay, sorry, excuse me. I'm just trying to get this set up for others to join. That might be, you're about there. Yeah, that's where it is. This here.
And if you can hear me, that's on your end. This- All right. Oh, I think I can handle that. All right. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is David Allen Lambert. I'm the chief genealogist for the New England Historic Genealogical Society by and American Ancestors in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm delighted to be here. I'm actually a dual citizen, so I'm legally allowed to leave the country and come back into Canada. So I have that going for me. My mother was born in Toronto and came over when she was 6 months old in 1930 via the train right here, going across. And never knew living in Canada. And after my mother died, they had a thing called Waking Up Canadian. So I decided I would get back what she lost. I'm mostly Canadian. My dad's family are from New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland. And my family arrived in Toronto from England in 1910. My grandfather worked for Rogers Coal when they delivered coal in a wagon with horses. He served with the Canadian Expeditionary Forces, enlisted when he was 38 years old. And my grandfather decided to lie about his age because that would be a great thing to do as well. He was 15. And well, my grandfather didn't make it over there because he fell off the horse and his mother got word of it. And I think she got him a bigger whooping than any of the Kaiser's army would have been overseas. But the reason I'm here today is not to talk about my family, but just to kind of give you an association of my Ontario roots, is to talk about researching Revolutionary War family, your loyalist ancestors left behind, and that's okay. I may not appear to be the enemy, but I also have UEL ancestors. My family left Westchester County, New York to fight with the Queen's Rangers and ended up settling in Nova Scotia, Canada. So I have them on both sides of the war, or as we like to say in America, the first Civil War. Now, where I work in Boston, we have been around since 1845. We're the oldest genealogical organization in North America, and for that matter, actually in the world. We started 177 years ago. Now, I've been with the organization longer than anybody, but not that long. I started nearly 30 years ago, and I got interested in genealogy when I was 7 years old, nearly a half a century, long before there was any DNA research being done. There weren't any shaky leaves on Ancestry.com because it didn't exist yet. And Family Search was a great library you could visit, but you couldn't really do of anything but look at microfilm and books. How we've changed. Well, my website, American Ancestors, has a plethora of things that you can use when you're researching people that your loyalist ancestors left behind. Now, I mean, if you're a loyalist descendant, raise your hand. Your ancestors were loyalists? Okay. Okay, well, that's all right. I know there are probably spares in the room that we could share with other people. The idea behind it is if they came from New York and New England, we have those resources. Now, they probably may have been from that region, and I'd like to just quickly introduce some of the sources that we have at American Ancestors. And I believe that I am logged in from before. So if we go simply to search, our databases A to Z, I don't care about a pop-up ad right now, but that's going to just happen anyways. Here we go. Here we go. So we have 490 databases, and as Steve had told you earlier, the association with Canadian gravestones, this is a wonderful combination that we have now added. And if you picked any part of our collection, the strength, of course, is going to be New England, because where the original location of our organization comes from, but that's what we've expanded to American Ancestors. So we have a variety of things that we've made digitized, so it makes it easier for doing any New England research or New York research for that matter. If I go into something as simple as the Massachusetts Vital Records, okay. This database, whoops, I hate when it swaps. 1850. Here we go. This database has majority of the published vital records from Massachusetts Bay Colony and Plymouth Colony from 1620 to 1850. So these were done as tan books. The reason they were created because of all the different hereditary societies that were popping up. And they wanted to basically look at the records that existed before Massachusetts mandated statewide vital records. We're the earliest state in the United States to require that every birth, marriage, and death was recorded. And that started in 1841. So this 10 years after the 1850 gave a little bit of an overlap to it. But if I was going to go in here and search on my, let's say my fourth great grandfather, who we'll probably be talking about a bit today. And I put in the range of when he was born. And I'm not even going to select birth. I'm just going to hit search. I'll find the first match is actually his birth record from 1737. And if I click on it, I get a capsulized view of the published vital records of Newbury, Massachusetts. And because everybody in Massachusetts was born in alphabetical order, it's very easy to use this book. So you get all of the other people. And the nice thing, of course, you can make this full screen, and you can go back and change your page as you wish. And if you like that view, you can just go in and you can zoom in a little bit more. You can download it, you can print it, you can send it to your cousin Mabel in British Columbia. I mean, it's a wonderful collection and is very, very easy to use. Now, that being said, that is a published resource, and it's one of our more popular ones. But one of the things that I like to show people are the original records that we have that deal with early people of New England. If I go back to our database list, one of the things we did was we collaborated with the Family History Library and with our Supreme Court archivist to get our probate records, our last will and testaments, guardianship records online, which was a great asset for research because a lot of times we'd have to go to the archives, request it, or you did it in writing and then you waited about a month or so and you might have got a copy. So if I go to Essex County, and if any of you have heard of the Salem witchcraft trials, that's the heart and county for where that took place in Salem, Massachusetts. And just for the added advantage of letting you know, yes, you were in the presence of someone whose 10th great grandmother was accused of witchcraft. But don't worry, she wasn't executed. She bribed the jailer and was actually let go. She lived till 1700. We're not exactly who she bribed or how much she paid him, but she survived. but her name was Mary Perkins Bradbury. The American historian Doris Kearns Goodwin, I did her genealogy for her, and I was able to let her know that we shared a witch together. Okay, so I'm going to go to Essex County Probate. And we have the file papers right here from 1638 to 1881. So I could go in and know, let's, keeping charity at home. Let me pull up my same fourth great grandfather when he dies in 1807. And like I say, I could put a wide range. I'm just cutting to the chase on this. All right. Go here. And sure enough, the first thing it tells me is that there are more than one. That's good because it's a bit of a clue. I didn't hit specifically, so it didn't just give me 1807, but here's Captain Jonathan Poor, who'll be more relevant why he was a captain very shortly when I go into my Revolutionary War talk. So this was originally something that you could only get in person. Then it was microfilmed. Then we worked to get them digitized. All right, I'm trying to scroll up. This is a different computer than what I'm used to using. So where my fingers are supposed to land is a little different. Here we go. This is what I want. So all of the receipts from his last will and testament are right there, including his inventory of his estate, which is great because that's the way you know if your family are truly hoarders, because you have the same stuff that your fourth great grandparents had because you've got it in your cupboard. And that's, I think the TV show Hoarders started in Massachusetts. So unfortunately, I do not have anything that my fourth great grandfather owned except for a little of his DNA, but that's not listed on the inventory. But this gives you an idea of how important these are. Probate records are one of the key things that people will overlook. They're looking for the I, David Lambert, leave the following to my children and grandchildren, et cetera, et cetera. But if you die intestate, a probate inventory offers you something remarkable. You are now transported back in time and you have pulled open the door of your ancestor's house and you're looking in the cupboards, in the chests, in the pantries, in the barn. They now are more than names and dates. Genealogy is truly more than that. It is more than just the dash, and this allows you to find out what that dash consists of. And that is because you can find out their belongings. You might find tools that your ancestor was a blacksmith or a carpenter, or in some cases, your ancestor may have owned other things, human property, and you find out that your ancestor was an enslaver. And this is where we find these hard facts of evidence of our ancestors' past, even when it's something we may not feel comfortable about learning. But we allow all these documents, thousands of them, for every county in Massachusetts, from Plymouth County in the 1620s all the way through most of the middle of the 19th century. And these are the cousins your loyalist ancestors left behind. But also, if it's Massachusetts, for instance, these are your loyalist ancestors, because these are where their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, the ones that didn't seek to leave to go to Canada, as mine did as well. So that's just a couple of things. I mean, what else do we have? Let me touch base on an idea of a periodical. So one of the things that we've published now for 175 years is the New England Historical and Genealogical Register. We started publishing it 4 times a year in 1847. And now we've expanded so far, and for many, many years, it's been more than just New England. It's just that if you get stuck with a name that you've had for such a long time, you rebrand yourself as American Ancestors. And that's for all the people in America. But technically, I think we also expand to North America because we have Canadian resources. We have Irish resources, British resources, et cetera. So we become where our ancestors came from and where our ancestors went to. My wife's family are Canadian as well, but they weren't loyalists. They were planters that settled in Acadia after the expulsion of the French in the 1760s. So I can find her family in records like this. So if I went into this collection here and I searched on, since we are so close to Halloween, the infamous Salem witchcraft trials, and I searched on Rebecca Nurse, one of the unfortunate two sisters that were accused of witchcraft, I can go in and find every issue that has Rebecca in it from 1847 till 2022. And most people will say, well, that isn't the year she was alive. A periodical, of course, is covering a story. It could be about somebody who lived in the 14th century, as well as somebody who lived in 1890 when the article was written. So we can find a variety of different things in here. This one, of course, as you can see, the page is turned on its side, but that's okay. It's actually a good example because then I can turn the page this way and zoom right in. And don't worry, if you can't see the T's crossed and the I's dotted, you can zoom in really, really well and see the actual document. And this is where we find that having the availability of not needing 177 years of books at home is an advantage. Also may help your spouse want to keep you in the house with them, because digitally, I can read every page of the register. Not that I think anyone's ever read every page of the register, but it's right there in its index. This also includes other periodicals such as the American Genealogist. It includes the Essex Genealogist, the Essex Antiquarian, the Pennsylvania Genealogist, parts of the New York Genealogical and Biographical Record. We have over almost 500 databases with over 1.4 billion searchable names, and many of them are unique. The other thing that we also have in our collection is a digital library and archive. That will allow you to look at original things from our manuscript collection, where we have over 28 million manuscripts. We have really become the attic of America in some respects, genealogically speaking, and we're always adding things. Bible records come into us on a monthly basis that somebody has found on eBay, or in an antique bookshop, or someone like myself who at 19 years old went to a yard sale and found the 18th century Baptist church records mixed in with a bunch of old farmers' almanacs for 20 cents. And I made the oldest Baptist church in Bristol County now older than all others because they thought they had lost their records and they didn't know they had the records earlier. Ministers back then used to be itinerant and travel around from church to church, and Baptist and Methodist ministers back in the day actually used to keep their own records. You didn't have to turn them in. Okay, so this is really just a quick introduction, if you will, to American Ancestors, americanancestors.org. You can visit and sign up as a guest member for free if you like it. We are always running specials. And one of the things I do is Family History Radio at Extreme Genes. And I can tell you that every week I give a coupon code that will save you $20. All you have to do is remember to check out one episode. Chances are, if you listen to one from a year ago, it's the same code. So not a real hard way of saving $20. Anyway, that's my stump speech for that. Now let's go back to the lecture itself, which this is part of the lecture, but I want to introduce you to the resources that you can look at. The American Revolutionary War. Yes, it might send chills down your spine as it did for some of my ancestors who fled to Nova Scotia because they weren't in favor of turning against the crown. But you may have ancestors that did fight in the American Revolution or fight against those that were causing it. I think it's important to know your enemy. And also it's important to know the resources that are available. You may find that your ancestors started to fight for the cause, but then changed their mind. There are loyalists that actually originally marched on Lexington and conquered, and then just did not feel that that cause was going to move forward, or they felt a stronger pull to their native England. So American records, just like in any military, I don't care what side of the border you're on, determining if he fought. Back in the day, there were very few ladies who fought in the American Revolution, but there is one. Her name is Deborah Sampson Gannett. She was a Massachusetts soldier who posed as a man and served as Robert Shirtliff. When she was fighting the Loyalists in upstate New York, she was injured and found out to be a lady. She met years later in a neighboring town, Paul Revere. You may have heard of him. Listen, my children, ye shall hear the midnight ride of Paul Revere, Longfellow's poem. So this story connects Paul Revere with Deborah Sampson because he helped her get a pension, and she was a pensioned lady from the Revolutionary War, and she actually fought. Now, too young or too old. It's looking at your genealogy and trying to determine if your ancestor may have been in the Loyalist forces or American forces, may have been in the War of 1812, whatever the case. My great-grandfather fought for the Fenian uprising in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I think all they did was sit around and drink and tell stories because there were no Fenians that actually went to Halifax, Nova Scotia, but he did get a medal for it. Look at the age of your males. Are they 18 to 35 years old? Now, that being said, there are wide ranges for the 18th century because an average birth year may be 1735 to 1760, but there are extremes. One of my ancestors in the American Revolution, Nathan Whitney, he was born in 1710. He marched for 3 weeks in his 60s, had probably some complaints to it, but he also served with his son born in 1730 and his grandson born in 1760. So 3 generations of my ancestors fought from the same town, or started to at least. And you'll also find extremes of people born into the 1760s because the war goes on until the early 1780s, of course. Now, like I said, in New England, nobody throws anything out. You may have letters, diaries, paintings, swords. You might even have a discharge paper. Now, my laser pointer doesn't work so good on the TV screen over here, but I can tell you that one of the signatures there in the middle is for none other than General George Washington, making this a very valuable document if you possess such a thing, unless you're someone like myself and your ancestors' discharge paper looks like something you folded up after getting an ATM receipt and spilled a cup of coffee on it. And that's pretty much what mine would have looked like. And that's just a very simple proof that you could legally go home. Many of you had finished your term of service, or you had an injury, or whatever the case might have been, you are now permission to leave. This document is very important years later, because in 1818, the federal government of the United States issues pensions, or even earlier, they issued bounty land. Now, the problem with genealogy in general, now I started when I was 7, a tin type photograph fell out of a book. I asked my grandmother who it was. The idea that a 80-year-old lady could have had actually a father, and the idea that I'd only lost a goldfish, it shouldn't be a problem for you to meet a man born in 1848 and 1976, right? So I said, well, when can I meet him? Well, he was dead. But she had the story of her father. And he was the great grandson of Jonathan Poor. And she knew stories from him because he knew his grandfather, who was the son of the Revolutionary War soldier. So this telephone game that we play as children, remember the paper cups or the tin cans and the string, and you yell loud enough? Well, you could hear them anyways because they were yelling. It really didn't reverberate too much through the can to the string. What happens when that story changes centuries? A story that has been passed down in your family must be a real doozy if you can remember it 200 years later, when most people who just start genealogy don't know even the maiden names of their great-grandparents, let alone some of their grandmothers. Taking that lost in translation and taking it with a grain of salt, but not ignoring it, because every story has an ounce of truth in there generally somewhere. Preserving your stories are a very important thing. And a lot of times in genealogy, I find that people take oral history and say, nope, doesn't fit into the genealogy program I'm using. I'm just going to throw it away. You need to put that in the story, the narrative. And then people say, but I don't have a document. I can't prove it. Yes, you can. You're the source. The source that you now footnote as, I heard that my ancestor was in the American Revolution, but then became a loyalist and left for Ontario. And I believe they were from New York. Well, what's the source of that? Well, you're the source, right? But where did you hear it? I heard this story in 1971 while visiting with my grandmother and her sister. All right, that's great. Now, you're not the only person the same age in your family. When you send your holiday cards out, or when you get on the phone, or when you're FaceTiming with one of your cousins, or talking on the phone, do you remember that story my grandmother told me? Did you hear a variation of that? And it might be a little bit of a different part of that loyalist story, or that American Revolutionary War story that handed down, or she heard it differently. Fine, include it in the paragraph. And footnote, that is another footnote to your story. If we ignore family stories, we're truly ignoring family history. Genealogy, as Steve or anyone in this room will probably tell you, names and dates are important. That's what's carved on a gravestone. But that dash is what I've been searching for since I was 7. I want to bring these ancestors to life. And when my grandmother told me that her father remembered the son of a Revolutionary War soldier, it was mind-boggling. I'm now could time travel, if you will, 200 years to almost the same year I started. I started genealogy in 1976. This is a man who was in the Revolutionary War in 1776. Now, that means we could also find out things we don't want to know. Now, I can tell you that I have seen people cringe when they find out, oh, I knew my ancestor was a this battle and that, and he was a hero and he was the aide de camp to George Washington, only to find out your ancestor deserted, went home and was sat in the pillory in the stocks because he went AWOL. Records will set the great divide and equalize your family oral traditions and sometimes change them. So you just write that down. I was always told this story. When I did some genealogy, it disproved it. But now what you're doing is that tumbleweed in the family history is not rolling incorrectly anymore. It's now rolling with the correct story. And the next generation will know because you're going to write it down. You're going to put it on your Facebook account or wherever you store your genealogy, maybe on the cloud or just in a notebook. The story ends there. The falsehood of a family tradition that may have been changed for whatever reason now is corrected. And ultimately, well, we're proving or disproving our grandparents, aren't we? But at least our grandchildren won't say we told them a fib. Cemetery clues and pitfalls. Is there a gravestone for your veteran you're researching? That cousin who was in the American Revolution, that we didn't talk about up in Ontario, but we know a few of them existed. That real Civil War of the 18th century. Well, yeah, many of them have gravestones. This is Jonathan Poor, my fourth great grandfather, who we started the American Ancestors search with right there. He's got an American flag. That metal marker is the Sons of the American Revolution flag marker that was issued. And that's great. However, I'm going to let you put on your visualization and imagine I'm mowing a lawnmower in a cemetery and I hit a flag marker. Well, that flag marker is going to go like a javelin into outer space and land way over there. Then comes great people like Steve and Associates who are copying gravestones down, and they find that flag marker and they put it back in the ground because it must have been for that grave right there. But no, they know to look at that gravestone because that flag they just put in the grave was for a 4-year-old girl who died in 1914 who couldn't have been a loyalist or an American Revolutionary War soldier. Just happened to be that's where that flag from that lawnmower incident landed. So what do kids do? Well, kids get mischievous and run around with flags, and then their parents yell at them and they're like, oh, put the flag down, and they run. There's many reasons flags could be in the wrong place. It could be in the wrong place because someone presumes somebody of a right age may have fought in a particular war and put it there. And one of the pitfalls we suffer from genealogy in America. Are there transcribed gravestones? Well, we hope so. In American Ancestors, we have thousands upon thousands of transcribed gravestones, some of which date back before the 1850s, that people would go out and write down what was on a gravestone. And that includes those marble gravestones, that are sugared away with the beautiful patina of marble you might see in a church or on a plaque. Inside is nice and smooth as glass. When you expose it to the elements of winters up here in Ontario, just like they are in New England, you lose that sheen and it becomes like sandpaper. And more sand falls from the hourglass of that stone, technically, you lose part of the inscription. And that's why so many of them are hard to read. So transcribed gravestones a century ago are important. So the work that all of you are doing now for Ontario to copy the gravestones, future generations will thank you. So continue doing what you're doing. It's tremendous work. So where is a spouse buried? Well, I have one ancestor who was a colonel in the Revolutionary War. I can tell you where his first wife is buried. And beside her is his second wife. And besides her is his third wife and two of his sons, all like neat in a row, like it was a plot in the 18th century. He doesn't have a stone. Didn't have a very big estate. I can presume he's buried there, so we can put a cenotaph. Cenotaphs are important. If you have a speculation that on a family farm there may have been a gravestone and the person's military in Canada, Steve can tell you more about it, but you can actually request the Canadian government to have a military marker, which they did for my great uncle. I'm segueing a little bit. My grandfather's brother was with the Canadian Expeditionary Forces in Nova Scotia in World War I. They remembered where they buried him in 1967. It was in a churchyard, probably a couple of times bigger than this room, but they couldn't remember exactly where they buried him. So over by the gate is a memorial cenotaph to him. So he'll never be forgotten. Transcribing gravestones, photographing gravestones, visiting a cemetery, showing the next generation where your parents or grandparents are buried is ensuring that the future of genealogy, your own family story, is going to be preserved. And in the greater good, if you work on a project, even if you don't have anybody buried in that cemetery, you're helping someone else with their ancestors. I like to call it genealogical karma. So remember, when you're looking for a marker down in the States and you look at it, read the date. Make sure that it wasn't a 4-year-old that wasn't born until 150 years after a particular war is representing where that flag lays. Forgotten images. Do you have a photograph of your soldier or the cousin of your ancestor? Well, it's possible if that veteran lived into the 1830s. In America, in 1839, the process of Charles Daguerre for daguerreotypes. These are metal photographs. These are before glass, which became ambrotype, tin, which were tin type, and paper, which are album imprints and cabinet cards. These are the earliest forms of photography. Now, you may have seen a painting, you may have even seen a silhouette of somebody from back then, but did you realize that there actually are photographs of American Revolutionary War soldiers? I know because I worked on a book with Maureen Taylor called The Last Men of the Revolution. Each one of those photographs I own. They were hand set into a book in the 1860s. All of these are men in their hundreds who were alive in the 1760s, who were young men in the American Revolution. That being said, in her book, we have a photograph or two of some of the last loyalist soldiers that lived into the 1860s, 1850s. So you may have a photograph of your ancestor, you may just not realize it. Metal photographs are tough because there's no place to write it. So you have to hope that people identify it on the back or slipped in a slip of paper, or that story was passed down. So in research, when you're dealing with military in the 18th century, there's a real plethora of things to look for. There are muster rolls. Those are basically the mustering. It's like today, if we had a sign-in sheet, this is the muster of today's meeting for the Niagara Peninsula chapter of OGS. Now, if it was a muster roll back then, those are the people that were present and accounted for, including those of you that are at home. And that is a record. That muster roll is where you can tell your ancestor marched and who they served for, what their rank is, generally how long they served. If they're descriptive rolls, which come out a little later during the American Revolution, they'll tell you the person had a ruddy complexion, had blonde hair, blue eyes, was perhaps foreign born. Maybe they were born in Ireland. So the descriptive roles are great. And also, of course, age. Quartermaster roles are also important because your ancestor may have lost something, like their musket or their blanket or their jacket or whatever was issued to them. And then when they get their final pay, The quartermaster will report did not turn in his musket or powder horn, minus 10 pounds from his pay. So that being said, that's another way you can find proof of somebody serving. Published genealogies are great. The 19th century saw the first start of published genealogies in North America, may it be Canadian or American. These are done and people would take those stories. Now, if you're publishing something in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, these are the children and grandchildren generation of the Revolutionary War. So some of those stories may have been recorded as we have seen. So they give you a clue. Correspondence from officers. Well, the person in charge is going to keep track of all the records. So you need to, what I call in any, this is good for any military research, adopt the regiment. That basically means that you need to know who the higher up officers are, because your ancestor may have not left a diary, wrote a letter, or even had something written up in the official reports. But I bet you his officer did. And did his officer talk about your ancestor for doing something heroic or something very stupid? We'll find out. And that's why you really, truly need to adopt that. In America, town histories were starting to be published right after the American Civil War in great magnitude. And of course, we're now celebrating the centennial of American independence, the American Revolution. So they are smack dab with every soldier in a community history that fought in the American Revolution, and they'll write up stories. And sometimes these are those stories that grandma told them may not have any proof or story at all, that they were the aide-de-camp to George Washington. I can tell you, if there were as many aide-de-camps of George Washington that claimed to be, there would have been no soldiers other than people just ushering around George Washington's trunks and horses and supplies. But I'm sure he would have been pleased with that. But anyways, that's where the great divider of finding out the truth of oral tradition is sometimes looking at the original records versus what somebody writes in a history. As I had mentioned, pension files start to be issued in 1818 for soldiers. So if you were a state troop and you're still alive or your widow is alive, you could apply for a pension. Bounty land existed earlier than that as well. There was a fire in Washington in 1800. No, it's not the one from the War of 1812 that the British burnt Washington. They had already burnt it in 1800, but it didn't add insult to injury that then the British came and burnt Washington and destroyed all of our early bounty land records. So we have no proof of what land our ancestors got, but that's okay. We also came over here and did a lot of damage too. So it's probably a good divider. Journals and diaries are great because those are first person. And if you can find that for your ancestor, what a great, important find that is. Journals can tell you the detail day by day in the first person account, and it can add more color than you could ever find in some official report because you're getting their personal perspective. In 1840, the United States Census was still statistical. It listed the head of household and numerical, how many under 10, how many under 20, but actually it was the first census to actually include exact ages and people outside the household. Now, but only for this one instance, and I'll show it to you. It didn't happen full scale till 1850. Maps are amazing, but maps are amazing now to the point that all you have to do is say, hey, Google, show me a map of Lundy's Lane battlefield and pull it up on Google Earth so I can drive to it. Well, that is the type of thing where you get the technology at your hands or in your computer, and it makes it a great deal easier for people to find locations because you know you want to pack up all of the kids and go on that summer vacation to the battlefield that your ancestor was at, and then get out of the car and realize GPS has now put you in the Walmart parking lot somewhere in upstate New York. Adopt the regiment. That fan approach, families, associates, and neighbors, adopting the regiment will give you more. You're taking the blinders off of your own ancestors' story and applicable to any war, and you're researching the actual details that help you tell your ancestors' story through the voice of someone else. So published accounts, the muster rolls, it's great when you can find something published. Now here, you're going to get so tired of my fourth great grandfather, but since charity starts at home, here's my family. My fourth great grandfather, Jonathan Poor. This is a great write up in something that the daughters of the American Revolution, or the sons of the American Revolution, will accept as proof. This is a transcription that was done in the 1890s of his service. You see anything wrong with it? No, I mean, obviously DAR and SAR sees no problem with it. Doesn't have any sources. The only thing we know is that this was copied from the Massachusetts State Archives. And I worked there 35 years ago. And I can tell you that there's not one sheet of paper for every Rev War soldier. It was compiled from other records, page by page by page, but nobody ever put the time and effort to put the footnotes where it came in. So I decided I was going to be that person who would give the extra detail from my application for the Sons of the American Revolution. So the main part of this here is the opening battle. The shot heard round the world for the American Revolution occurred at the Lexington Green on the 19th of April, 1775, when the British troops out of Boston were going to seize the powder in Lexington and then march on to Concord Bridge and get the powder there as well. So this one red line tells me that my ancestor was a captain of a company of militia under Colonel Samuel Garish's 2nd Essex Regiment, which marched on the alarm of April 19th, 1775, and served 6 days. Marching on the alarm is a key thing that people are very proud of, that they figured that the ancestors got the word from Paul Revere and the other riders like William Dawes, and they all made it to Lexington Green, popped out of the bushes and said, bang, and got the whole British Army just clear there. That did not happen. Most people who marched on the alarm were marching on the alarm. That means that all of a sudden, right now, if we had to grab buckets because there was a fire out near Niagara Falls and we were going to have to march there, we heard the alarm, we're going to get there. Some of us may be on horses, but most of them are marching because we're a militia. You're not going to be there in time. Same is true with most of the people who lived on the outskirts of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Maine. They didn't make their Lexington Green or Concord Bridge. They made it to the Battle Road. That means when the British were getting back to Boston. So they're taking pot shots of them in the woods, and basically becomes the first form of uncontrolled civil warfare because you lined up as soldiers. You fought like gentlemen and you aimed your rifle, reloaded, packed in, and gone behind the next person. No, the American militia were just along the woods taking pot shots at the British as they're retreating back to Boston. That's where they hit. The British took most of the losses at Lexington and Concord. So my ancestor was probably one of those guys. And so I wanted to find the proof of this. I looked at the microfilm that Family History Library had already done of our Massachusetts muster rolls. Family Search kindly has digitized them. How many of you have benefited by the tremendous work Family Search has done by digitizing and saving you from having to look for microfilm? It's just so many of us have had great sources like this available and microfilm, but now we can search them at home. So I looked at the muster roll and I found this card from my fourth great grandfather, Jonathan Poor. And sure enough, it talks about him marching on the alarm, serving 6 days. It says that he's with Garish's unit, but that's still not good enough for me. That's not 18th century. That's partly printed. Where did that come from? At the bottom, it says it's from the Lexington Alarm, volume 13, page 43. That's the source I need to find now. Luckily, Family Search also microfilmed and digitized those. So I can go to that volume of Lexington Alarm, volume 13, and I find this. It's a handwritten muster roll. A lot more information than there's just those 2 or 3 lines I just showed you. And it also lists all the men that served with him. The people that I will now adopt, and looked up their pensions to see if they mentioned hopefully kind things about my ancestor who was their captain. And it gives me the amount of days they marched. And then I saw something sneakily suspicious. Right above the word Newbury, I saw his name and his rank captain. And I realized just then and there, I wasn't looking at his orderly's notes. I was looking at his handwritten record. My fourth great grandfather wrote this. How do I know this? That's a forensic genealogy. That's when you take a known signature, like a deed or a probate or something you might have, and you match it. The signature on the top is from 1775 when he marched on Lexington and conquered. The signature on the bottom is in 1807 when he signed his last will and testament. I think it's a pretty good match. So now I can cite that source. I'm not just settling for something that's published that didn't have a footnote. I can go and tell that this source is the muster and payroll 1763 to 1808 of the Revolutionary War, that volume 13, page 43, and the family history library microfilm, and the website itself that it's on, the date that I found it, and the original repository. Yes, it might seem overkill, but I'm not resting on the laurels of older genealogists and historians. I am seizing history by its ears and putting it into the correct context. So we're telling the full story and confirming the facts. So did that with a muster roll. How do you do that with a pension? Well, there was a great man in Texas by the name of Virgil D. White, and he had all of his associates go through and abstract all the genealogical data from the American Revolutionary War pension files. That was great. This $800 set of books is still, like, I call them toe breakers, because they're really, you drop that on your foot, you will break your toe. But they had everybody. That is before Fold 3 came up and digitized all of them. So we can still turn to them and get a little abstract, and I can find my other fourth great grandfather, Joshua Whitney. It says he has a pension in 1818. Jonathan didn't get one, by the way, because he died 11 years too early. But Joshua did. So let's talk about him. And so I can find a little bit of the facts about him, but now I can go to Fold 3, search on pensions, and go right into the actual document. There is over, I think this one has 23 pages. This is the envelope itself the pension sits in the National Archives in Washington. It's not an index card. And it tells me his soldier's pension number, that he serves from Massachusetts. And these are the beginning pages of his pension. Most people go past it and say, oh, that's just junk. It's not junk. That's actually the wrapper sheet. Pensions weren't conveniently put in acid-free folders in 8.5 by 11 envelopes back in 1818. They were folded into a 3-part piece and then put into a wooden drawer. And these are the wrappers. These are the docket envelope size that held all the papers. Why is that important? That could write something, oh, I don't know, the date of death when the soldier's claim was closed, the name of his widow, etc. You want to look at every sheet of paper when you're dissecting a document like this. Here is actually his application. He didn't write this himself, but he did in fact sign it at the bottom. So I know he was literate. It talks about the service that he had. And what I did find out about Joshua, which was amazing, I live one town away from where Deborah Sampson, the woman who posed as a man in the Revolution, he served in her regiment. They were both fighting in the Continental Army against the Loyalists in upstate New York, probably not very far across through Niagara from here. And to me, that was a personal connection, but it told more of the story. It wasn't just a name and a date. The other thing pension files have, and this is that fan approach again, adopting the regiment. If I served with you in the military, you may have been in a battle and injured yourself, or you had some ailment. I'm going to write a letter of for your benefit. I'm going to basically writing an affidavit that I was there and I remember what happened to you. Well, these are great. And they may give a point of view that you may have never knew about your ancestor's injury or where he was. Most American genealogists, or those that spend any time during the Revolution, escape one important thing. If I scratch your back, you'll scratch mine. So what am I going to do for you? I'm going to write an affidavit on your pension. So every time you find an affidavit for American Revolutionary War soldier, you should also be looking for the affidavits from your ancestor to return that favor, either before or after that one. You may get a story about your ancestor being in a battle that he wasn't injured at, so there was no need for him to mention it in his pension. The other thing that you get are the first internal revenue examinations of your American cousins. This is in 1820. The pensions have been given out for 1.5 years now. And they realized that a lot of the people that were getting pensions really didn't need them. They were merchants, sea captains, mayors, governors, and they really had no need for them. So you had to give a financial accounting. My Joshua Whitney wrote down about his place in Buxton, Maine, that he had 9 acres of land with a small, poor house on it. One half of the land is very poor, and I'm in mere health. The only thing personal property has is a few necessities, articles of the house, and I have no income. So now I know that he's in his early 50s, around my age actually, has no income, lives in a house that's pretty much a shack on 9 acres of land. But what's in this is even more important at the bottom. It actually gives me the people in his household and their ages. Mentions Mary, a daughter, age 30, married, living with me part of the time. That's my ancestor. Huldah, Nancy, Elmira with their ages. And so it's an accounting of the household. Well, Joshua hit on really hard times because we know in 1821, he had to send another one of these in. They were only supposed to do it once. He sent in 2. The reason is because in 1820, something else happened. They had talked about his farm before. Now he says, I have no property. The 9 acres of poor land, which I mentioned in a former schedule in June last, has been taken from my execution of to pay debt owed against my estate. And I have no personal estate except for few meager household utensils for family use. I have no income and am still in debt and poor and needy. I really wanted to get a time machine and go back and give this guy a hand. But it also told me the family again. It's not Mary, my ancestor, it's not there. But Huldah and Elmira, who's Samuel? Samuel, age 24, a son lately returned from Canada, sick and unable to care for himself. He went to Ontario to seek a future and then got sick and went home. I never knew who Samuel was. I did know there was a Samuel Whitney who died in 1824 with no parents on the record. Now I know who he is. So we had an Ontario connection even then, nearly 200 years ago. Abigail Beecher, Mary Beecher, Samuel Beecher, these are his grandkids with ages, which makes it even more confusing because at this point in time, I had no idea what daughter married a Beecher because they're all listing his daughters by the first name because everybody else knows who they are, right? Don't you love that with ancestors? They always presume that we are going to know who the family dynamic is 100 years after they write something down on the back of a photo. This is my cousin Mary. Mary who? So these documents become very important. Now, when I'm looking at a pension that was written, 204 years ago, why is there a typed letter in here? The reason they're in there is because the people who joined the Daughters of the American Revolution and the Sons of the American Revolution are writing to Washington and asking for copies of their ancestors' paperwork so they can join. That's why there's a letter here from San Jose, California, from one of Joshua's descendants in 1924. The records are also available if you go to the National Archives to see in person. Now, not the pensions. Those have long been filmed and digitized. It would take an act of Congress to see them. But there are also a last document, a document you might think is so insignificant. It was the last final payment voucher. I mean, it's the last paycheck that they got. Well, for Joshua, I have been telling people about these. I said, you should look at them. You never know what you're going to find. So I used my own advice one year and I looked for it. They handed me a little folder about this big. So there's going to be nothing in here. Then I pulled it out and I was holding in my hands the original pension certificate issued by to my 4th great grandfather in 1818, a man who had next to nothing. This was his sole income, was this document. And when his pension ended, they had to send it back to the pension office, closing out the claim. Then there was this letter here, a letter that was held by his grandson who went to Portland, Maine to collect his last check in 1832 to probably pay for his funeral expenses. And it's signed by all of his daughters, making their marks in some cases, but with their married names. Folks, until I unfolded this very fragile document, there are 2 daughters of my ancestor. There are no birth, marriage, death, gravestone, probate, deed, anything. That's a solitary proof of their existence to their father, right there. And I ignored it because I figured it probably wouldn't be worth looking at. If you have the chance to look at something from long ago, just don't presume it doesn't have anything. The idea that your ancestor may have not had a probate, well, they didn't have much. Oh, they didn't own land because, well, I don't think I've ever heard that they had it. Take the rumor, wipe it away, and take a chance. I didn't, been very, very pleased. Now, I mentioned in 1840 that this was the first time in US censuses it gives an exact age. Well, not for the head of household, but if you served in the American Revolution or your spouse did and you were collecting a pension, one of the last columns in each town was the name of the pensioner, their exact age, and whom they were living with. First time it ever gives that family dynamic. I want to introduce you to the last soldier of the American Revolution. This is from the American side, Daniel Frederick Bateman, born October 9th, 1759, died April 5th, 1869, nearly 4 years after the end of the Civil War. Here's a man, one of many, who watched a country that was formed almost to be torn apart less than a century after the fact. He served in the Tryon County, New York militia from 1777 to 1781 as an 18-year-old and enlisted until he was 22. Take a good look at his face. Does he look familiar to you? Well, he should. I think he's the ancestor of John Wayne because they have the exact same facial structure. It haunted me for the longest time until I saw this picture of John Wayne. I said, John Wayne is Daniel Frederick Bateman. So I'm always wish that John Wayne had played in a Revolutionary War movie. He could have portrayed him. Look for the fellow diaries of your fellow soldiers that you're searching for. Published journals are great from the 19th and 20th century to take journals and diaries and put them out there for you to find them because you want to find day by day by day. I don't care if your ancestor is a gravedigger in Ontario or a soldier in the War of 1812 or an immigrant coming over from England in 1910 like my grandfather was. If there's a diary, it's going to tell you a story. So look for that in a military sense because it may add more meat to the story than you can find in the military records. A lot of these are transcribed, but keep in mind, a lot of diaries and journals may still be owned by the family or in little historical societies that don't have the budget to scan or put things online. That's why you have to use the term of boots on the ground. That means find where your ancestors from long ago or their cousins lived that you're searching and find out who the local town historian is. Call the public library and ask them an important reference question. Do you know when you get those genealogy questions in there, you can hear the librarian's eyes roll in the back of their head and they're like, yeah, who do you send it to? Because that person is the one that you want to become new best friends with and send a big box of Tim Hortons mini bits and coffee to, or sneak it across the border and make them your new best friend because they are the ones that can look at these original records that you can't get online. They're not on Ancestry, Family Search, but Historical Society doesn't have enough money to have maybe keep the electricity on next month, but they have this important artifact. Look locally. Another place that you can search for American Revolutionary War records is on American Ancestors, which we talked about earlier. We have some things there. Fold 3 is a great place. I mean, there were over 500,000 records alone for the American Revolution. And that's true if you're finding soldiers that fought on both sides. Now, if you really are interested, friends that you have an American Revolutionary War soldier, that's okay. Your secret's safe with me. I'm the state historian of the Sons of the American Revolution, by the way, so it's okay. You could join any number of these. The National Society of Daughters of the American Revolution, the National Society of Sons of the American Revolution. If you've got youngsters that are interested, you can have the National Society of Children of the American Revolution, the General Society of the Sons of the Revolution, Officers of the War, Society of the Cincinnati, or the Daughters of the Cincinnati. Now, I'm a member of 3 of those, and no, I'm not a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. I'm sure you wanted to know that. But these are a great way of networking, finding other cousins. I had a gentleman when I joined the Sons of the American Revolution came to my installation. This is during the Congress in Boston a few years back. And he says, "Nice to meet you. My name's George. I am also a descendant of Jonathan Poor." I said, "Wow, that's nice to meet you." And then he proceeded to tell me, "Do you know that I actually have a painting of his daughter?" I said, "You have a painting of my 3rd great grandfather's sister?" "I have no photograph of my 3rd great grandfather." "And you know that I have the sword from the War of 1812 of her husband?" If you're interested, I might let you have them after I kind of got tired of having them. Sometimes joining an organization adds an interesting network. Now, that being said, I can qualify to join the United Empire Loyalists, and I think that I need to create an American branch. Why not? I want to thank you very much, and I'll be glad to entertain any questions you have about this subject, genealogy in general. After doing it for nearly 50 years, I've had a few chances of getting some reference questions answered. Thank you so much. Any questions at all? Okay. Full. It is. It's owned by Ancestry.com. It was originally a standalone company. It's one of the companies that Ancestry took into their fold, no pun intended. It's tremendous for American government records, especially military, may it be the American Revolution, the Civil War, War of 1812. For instance, the War of 1812 American for pension files. I think they're through the letter S right now. It was all crowdsource funded. Federation of Genealogical Societies, which is now part of NGS, National Genealogical Society, they became the same organization, would go around to conferences and raise money to get these digitized, to put them on for free. So you could search those for free. And again, the idea of looking outside the box, or better yet, if you collect names. I mean, you may not want to admit having an American soldier in your family tree as a cousin, but you're collecting everybody with the last name of Brewster. You can look at a database like that and really get a lot. So there is more and more that's being added. Currently, they're working in digitizing the Civil War service files. They've already started to do the pension files for the Civil War, the earliest ones from 1861 to 62. And you think about wars lasting a long time. Let me let you know that the last American Revolutionary War widow died in 1906. And the last American Civil War widow died in 2020. She was nearly 100. She was 100 years old. She was a young girl who married a man during the Great Depression because he wanted to leave her his pension. When he died, she was his caretaker. They never lived together, but she never collected it because she didn't want to offend his daughters, who were much older than she was. So, any other questions? Fold3 is a wonderful website. Any other genealogy questions, or are you just hankering for that lovely dessert that we have in the back? Well, thank you very much. You've been a great audience, and it's a pleasure to be back home, the place that my mother was born, and it's where my ancestors are from. Thank you. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Came to New York. Okay. So we do have some things. There's a collection of newspapers from the Boston Pilot called Missing Friends. It was ads that were posted. Boston Pilot was one of the largest Irish American newspapers. It was published between 1830 and 1930. You would find ads that people would put looking for my brother Thomas Kelly, who arrived into New York on 1842, known to have gone to Canada. They would post those ads. Those are all on American ancestors. Now, it doesn't mean that your ancestors' family were going to come looking for them. The other thing that we have are some of the records of some of the Boston immigrants that came over. There was a published report in the 1840s. But for New York passenger list, first place that comes to mind, of course, is Ancestry.com. So they have all the New York manifests. And the other one is going to be looking in Canada. And the problem is that the Canadian, and Steve, please join me on this, 1867 is when you start to see the multitude of the British passenger list coming into Canada that are on the Library and Archives Canada. Yeah, so if they were, as we call, two-boat Irish, that they came to Canada first because it was easier or more direct, and then they came down on a steamer or a clipper ship into Boston, it's entirely possible. Or they could have, come into another port. They could have come into Philadelphia. They could have come into Baltimore and then taken a steamer up. If they came to Boston and then took the ferry down to New York, early on, those were running at that point in time. So don't give up hope. They're there. All right. Well, thank you again, folks. I appreciate it. Yeah, of course.
I'll let you sit down. Well, thank you very much, Dave. Again, Dave come from Boston this weekend, and it was a great opportunity for our branch this is our first really in-house meeting that we've had in almost 3 years. And the numbers are, they're fantastic. I'll just put it at that. They're fantastic for being our first. But because we're the Niagara branch, we're so unique in our connection to the US. My wife and Dave are 11th cousins. They're actually related, way, way out there, but there is that connection. We have the connection with the New York genealogical societies. We have the suspension bridge marriages from the state of New York and from Niagara Falls here in Ontario. And then during dinner, I was shared with me, and Dave brought this up, where a lot of records are just hidden, or they're in historical societies. They may not have the funds. And our branch, and I'm looking at my 3 council members, making sure they're shaking their head yes and saying, not going no, stop talking, but we desire this branch is to go and empower and try to get this. And I learned over dinner tonight that the Port Colborne Archives has binders and binders of family histories from a pharmacist who made it his passion to be nosy in the community. And he documented all of this on prescription pads. And they're all sitting in these binders in the Port Colborne Archives, but quite a few of them. So it's a great opportunity for us to, as a branch, to reach out, to try to see what we can do to digitize them, to help them, get them online and share that. We'll share that little story in our next newsletter that will go out in November, just to let people know, because that's important and that's what we want to do. So don't give up. Some of us have been doing this a very, very long time, and some of us have only been doing it a very short time. But we will find it. It will get digitized. So again, on behalf of the branch, thanks for joining us tonight. There are desserts, there's tea, coffee, and enjoy the conversation. Have a good night. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for setting it all up.
You're very welcome. Perfect. And we're going to